In this tutorial, we're going to look at using Inkscape with Design Space. Some of the things we'll look at are combining files from a project so that you can do a single upload into Design Space, isolating pieces in case you want to cut a separate piece that was originally grouped in a file, um, sizing to content so that when you bring it back into Design Space, it will be the size you expect, and saving files. The files we will use in this tutorial are going to be from Dreaming Tree. That's at www.3dsvg.com. So when downloaded, they're in a format that typically has the layout of an entire cutting page. You bring it into Design Space and you cut, and it's already laid out as it needs to be. The score lines, if any, are on one path, and the shapes of the pieces are in another path. Normally in Design Space, you would attach those two together and then cut. So we'll have multiple files of this layout type, and that will make up an entire project. So what we want to do is look how we move those files together, so we only need to do one upload into Design Space, and also how to isolate single pieces along with their score lines to a larger layout. That might be a single piece. You may want to do it for each piece in an entire layout if you want to change the way it's laid out to fit on a different size paper or whatever. So we're going to begin with a blank Inkscape document, and I just want to show you how I set up this document initially. I use a size. We're going to bring up Control-Shift-D, bring up our document properties. I use display inches of inches. I use a width of 11.5 and a height of 11.5 and a scale of 72 user units per inch. We're going to minimize our document properties. Now, the first thing we want to do is bring in all of the files for a single project into one file for upload to Design Space. What we want to do is select all of the elements, all of the files that create that project. Once they're selected, drag them into your Inkscape canvas, and now they're all there. Now, these are the wrong size, and they're likely to be the wrong size because of the way that Inkscape interprets the files. We can minimize this now. So what I need to know is, how big should this project be? I looked at the documentation and I found out that the largest size for any of the pieces in this document, in this project, is 11 inches wide. So I'm going to select all of the objects. I'm going to lock the proportions, and I'm going to set the width with all of the objects selected to 11. It's now sized as it was in the earlier in the project files. Again, I'm going to select all either by drawing a rectangle around them or pressing Control A. And that will allow me to either move them onto the canvas if I want to work with them there, or if I just want to save this and do nothing else, what I can do is do a Control-Shift-R. A Control-Shift-R changes the size of the document to match the size of the contents. Now, when we brought all of these in, they were already centered on top of each other. If that had not been the case, you might need to recenter them. To recenter them, you would just use a Control-Shift-A to bring up your alignment panel and make sure that with all of them selected, they're centered. And again, a Control-Shift-R will resize your document to be the size of the contents. You can do that with either all of the objects selected or none. If you don't remember how to get to, or the keyboard shortcut, you can also resize your document by going to Document Properties, and down in this area under Custom Size, it's Resize Page to Content, and all we need to do is click this box, Resize Page or Drawing to Selection. Oops. That's one of the things I sometimes forget with Inkscape. I want to use the little arrow to collapse it, the document properties. So with that said, this will work as long as your pieces don't have stroke applied to them. If they do have stroke applied to them, taking this shortcut to just doing a Control-Shift-R to resize the document won't be exact. Inkscape has a bug that when you resize a document, it will take into account the stroke width, so your document will come out to the exact size that you expect. There is a way to address this, and if you're not sure whether your pieces have stroke applied, there is an alternative. So if that's the case, what you can do is draw a rectangle, change it to a shape with the Control-Shift-C, then change the size of this rectangle to be able to encompass all of your pieces. In this case, I'm going to set it to 11.4 to 11.4. I'm going to select everything and center and center. Now I'm going to do a Control-Shift-R, and we will know exactly what size our document is. I'm going to send that square to the back. So I'm going to come up here and just send it to the back. That way it won't block our view of our pieces when we go to upload it. Generally, you do not need to use this rectangle on the outside. But again, if you're not sure if any of your pieces have stroke applied, it's always safe to do that. Now we're going to save. Always save as. We'll call this example 1.svg. And now, very important, we need to make sure that we're saving as a plain SVG. So now we have our file saved and ready for upload into Design Space. So now in Cricut Design Space, we're going to go to Upload, click on Upload an Image. We can either browse for our file, or we can come over to our File Explorer and just drag our file in. And now you see that we have the entire file, in this case with the rectangle in the background that we use for sizing. And we can upload it and insert it. All right. The first thing I'm going to do when I get there is ungroup it and delete that big yellow square that we added for sizing. Just select it and press the delete key. All right, now if we are to select everything in our design space and look at the width, we see that the size is maintained. So that's very important, and that is how you can move all of your files into design space using a single Inkscape processed file. The next thing we're going to look at is how to manipulate the score lines and pieces paths so that we can isolate pieces for cutting separately or rearranging or whatever else we need to do. For that, we're going to go back to Inkscape. All right, we're back in Inkscape and now want to look at how to either isolate pieces or isolate all the pieces with their score lines. To do this, I'm going to drag in all of the pieces that we need. These will be in a single file if I'm using the Dreaming Tree file. So I'm going to come over to my project folder. In this case, we're just going to use just the Elements 1 shadow from the Vintage Coffee Grinder file project. I'm just going to take it and drag it into my Inkscape. In this case, the documentation told me that it was 11.4 inches wide. So I'm going to make sure that my dimensions are locked for proportion and change the width to 11.4. And with that done, we can see that if we were to look at the Objects panel, we have a group which consists of 2 paths. So I'm going to ungroup these. I'm going to press Ctrl-Shift-G. And now we have 2 paths, one that defines the score lines and one that defines the path shapes. Now let's say that I want to be able to process all of these pieces separately. I don't want them all grouped together. I need to have the score lines for this piece with this piece and be able to move it. We're going to look at how to do that now. It's a very straightforward process and doesn't really take that long. The first thing I'm going to do is lock the path shapes so that we're working just with the score lines. This is a single path. The first thing I want to do is break it apart so that we can get individual pieces of this path. When we break apart, it's going to change that path into a number of smaller paths. So I'm going to do a Shift Control K, or a path break apart. Now that I've done that, I have a lot of little paths that used to be part of one large score line path. At this point, I can select all of the short score marks and combine them into a single path. I just have to draw around or make a rectangle, select all of the path marks that belong to that piece, and do a Control K or do a path combine. And simply repeat that for each of the pieces. Control K, select the score marks for that piece, Control K, select the score marks for that piece, Control K. Okay, now we have 4 paths, four paths of score marks, one for each of the pieces' shapes. Now we want to work with the shapes of the pieces themselves. So for right now, I'm going to lock our score lines so I can work with just our path shapes. With our path shapes, again, those are all in one path, so we need to isolate those paths, or isolate that one path into a group of 4 paths. The same process, Control-Shift-K to break it apart, and select this piece is one path, as it turns out. Sometimes there may be more than one path, so always draw a rectangle around it and then press a Control-K to set that to one path. If there are cutouts inside of a piece or other elements, you want to make sure that those are taken into account, which is why we're drawing the rectangle to select the piece. If any of your pieces are such that drawing a rectangle around one would encompass another, then what you can do is you can just lock it over in your Objects panel until you're ready to deal with it. Control-K. And on this one, Control-K. All right, now I'm going to unlock everything. And right now we have 2 paths for each object, which I'm now going to, there's 2 ways to do this. You can group them, or you can turn them into a single path. I much prefer, for working with Design Space, when it is possible to do a Control-K and turn that into a single path. The only thing to be aware of is that when you do that, it's going to change the color of the object to whatever color, fill color, was on your scoreline path. So I'm going to do a Control-Z to revert that and show you how to fix it. I'm going to select just my path, my score path, scoreline paths, and I'm going to change their fill color to the same as the background on these pieces. To do that, I just push a D, make sure I have a sign turned on, and click in the color there somewhere. My fill is now that same dark gray. Press Escape to select nothing. Then select all of the score lines and shapes for that piece and press Control-K. At that point, it will maintain the color. Okay, at that point, I missed. I'm going to do that again just to make sure I got everything. There we go. Control-K. Control-K. And again, all we're doing is combining these 2 paths. Okay. Since there may be some stroke applied to it, we see that there's a stroke, looks like a very, very tiny stroke width of 1/100th of an inch. It's probably safer to use the rectangle approach and draw a rectangle for sizing. Control-Shift-C turns it to a path, and then we're going to change the dimensions of that path. Let's make it 11.7, 11.7. Yes, you can make it larger than the 11.5 cutting area, because we're going to be removing this before we make our project anyway. And just move our rectangle so that it encompasses all of our pieces. Then press Ctrl-Shift-R to size the contents. And I would again send that yellow square to the back so that we can see our pieces when we upload. Now save. Save as. We'll call this example 2. Example 2.svg, and again make sure that you save as a plain SVG. Let's bring that into Design Space. We'll get rid of what we have on our canvas here and upload. Example 2 by dragging it into our area there. You can see that it looks all pretty good. I'll type in upload and insert. And the first thing I want to do is ungroup and delete that background. It's too big to cut anyway. And now we can see that we have our pieces imported into the Cricut Design Space at the appropriate size. We can also move any of these around. If I wanted to cut just this piece, I can change the color of it, and then when I make it, I can cut just that color. Anyway, this is the way to isolate the pieces. Maybe I'd want to duplicate that piece but not have to worry about the others. It's just an easy way to make sure all of your pieces are separate and easy to work with, because when I make these projects, I sometimes need to remake single pieces, and this is a great way to do it. All right, so that shows how to isolate pieces. Hope that helps.